Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Noble Father podcast. I am your host, Theophilus. If you're joining me for the first time, this podcast is a work of passion. Something that I grew up wanting to be was a, present father, and I also wanted to be a police officer growing up. And this was something that I always had. My dad was very active in ministry and as a pastor. So for myself, growing up, I didn't have him to the quality and to the quantity that I would have wanted him. I am very fortunate, very lucky to have the father that I had, based on his upbringing. And today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about something like that. Just some updates for the supporters that I've currently got and for the patrons out there. I am going to start to make these episodes publicly available. And one of the things that I do here on this channel is that I like to support. I like the support. I need the support in order to continue doing this, to continue thriving and surviving doing this. This is what I do for work mainly, and I do not have. I don't focus my attention elsewhere besides, work doing ministry and I'm running a nonprofit with my father. So this is predominantly what I do. So if you're here for the first time, you're listening to the podcast, obviously, you will be able to find the YouTube versions of these podcasts on YouTube. That's where I'm going to be publicly posting them. But at the same time is one of the values that I give on the Patreon, and which is a membership site for people who want to support this work, is that I'm going to be posting weekly episodes for the patrons on Wednesdays. This is something that I'm going to continue to do and start to do now. And so in making these videos publicly available, I am going to be making the audio versions available to patrons through an additional podcast there. And you can get an RSS feed that's specifically for you, and you'll be able to find it. This week has been crazy, and a lot of things have happened. Had a get together with some friends over the weekend, and a conversation there sparked the topic that I'm going to be talking about today. But before I go into that, I wanted to shout out and give gratitude to a specific teacher of mine, a professor growing up, when I was in university or in college. So like I said before, I had a desire to be a police officer, and in my young adult years, I decided I want to go to school for it. There was a school out here in Vancouver called Langara, which had a really good 2-year criminal justice program that a lot of law enforcement officers would go and take to preface them going into policing. And in the course of that, I turned 2 years into 5 years. I was not a very studious person, and so I had a very good professor. And this professor was the dean of the criminal justice program at the time. His name is Daryl Keene. Daryl, thank you for being the professor you were to me. And, one of the things that you instilled in me that I still remember to this day is always this question you'd always ask us in all of our classes. You would never just give us the answers. You'd always make us dig for the answers. And you'd always ask us questions like, well, what does that mean? Okay, well, what does that mean? And you'd always help us. You'd always try to make us go to the bedrock of what a certain occurrence meant. And so we'd just dig, and we'd always try to go deeper and deeper. And that has been something that has stuck with me. And when I think back to why policing and why law enforcement, I think back to the schooling that I had, and for the work that I'm doing now on Noble Father and through this podcast. In doing podcast research and looking into content, I find myself asking myself that question all the time of, what does that mean? Okay, well, what does that mean? And looking into the causation of different things, of statistics, of analysis, of repercussions of certain actions that were taken, and being able to remain very neutral in that scenario of looking at a particular situation. And so this week has really been one in which that has really, in doing research, I feel like my life is this constant drawing of research. I'm constantly looking for answers, constantly seeking people's advice or seeking people's information about why they are the way they are and how it ties into the topic. The topic today really stemmed from the overall thing of decline in population or population decline. I feel like this week there was a lot of conversations that seemed to go that way, and this morning as I was doing the research into it, I was kind of blown away by how far my research took me, and just it's not just like one thing happened and that's it. It was like a whole bunch of things all tying together. And you hear me speaking about it, and if you're new here, you're going to realize this is that everything is related, and so when people ask me what my podcast is about, I say it's about fatherhood, of course, but it's also a personal development podcast, as well as everything. It's everything else, because everything is related to fatherhood, as you're going to find out today. Is that one thing leads to another, and it's going to cause another thing, and it ultimately all ties back to fatherhood. And so, today's episode, I want to invite you into my mind, right? Is in doing this research, I find myself going to so many different places, and so I want you to, if you need to, slow down this episode, because my mind races whenever I think of a topic, and then I go to think about, well, what does that mean? Well, how did this relate to this, and how did this cause this, and why did this make this do this, and so I'm making these connections in my mind, and I'm trying to speak about them, and sometimes in my mouth obviously can't keep up with those thousands, tens of thousands of thoughts that occur in my mind, and I'm going to do my best to slow this down for you so you understand. So the overwhelming topic for today is decline in population, or population decline. On the outset, where are we at as a civilization? We are at a point in time where people are getting married later. And we're also getting to a point where, if we're looking at marriages, people are choosing not to get married. They are just fooling around or whatever. They don't want to commit to anything long term with anybody. And so we have that, okay? So we have a decline in marriage, and then we have societal pressures being the way that it is right now on people, and also what that means for, let's just say, married couples, facing that. Rent is incredibly high, cost of living is high, inflation is skyrocketing. All these things are adding pressure to them not having children. And so in not having children, we're having this situation now in the modern world. All first world countries predominantly are all in the red. And when I say in the red, I mean like two people, a man and a woman, come together, get married, and they choose not to have children, which would mean that's a zero, obviously, right? Because they're not replicating themselves to have children, okay? When I say negative, it means that if they had two, then at least that's a stable plane. So there's two people getting together, having two children, stabilizes it, right? They've replicated that past their generation. A negative would be like 1.9, not having two children, choosing to only have one child. Choosing to have only one child would mean that's a negative still. And that's really where that stemmed from. Where did this conversation come up? This past week, over the weekend, I went to a get together with some friends, a potluck, and there was a guy there, and I like to get to know people, right? I'm very social, and I want to, learn who they are and what's their background, and so I met a Chinese couple, and they're from the mainland, and I just was curious about them. I was like, so, oh, you guys are together? Are you guys married? And they're like, yeah, we're married, and they're already kind of like in their 30s, right, mid 30s, and so I was curious. I was like, so you guys gonna have kids, or what's that thing? Some people might look at me and roll my eyes. I know for sure my wife would roll my eyes. Why would you ask such a personal question? Like, you just met them like a minute ago. But this is curious to me. There's really nothing off limits to me. Like, we're mature people, and so what is there what we can't really talk about in mature in a mature way. And so I asked him, hey, you guys planning on having children? And I was talking to the male, and he's like, no, we're not having kids. And he was responding for his wife as well. It's like, oh, we're not having kids. And for me, because I understand the cultural implications of that, right, is that as the male, you pass on the family name, you pass on the lineage, you pass on the legacy. And obviously my response immediately was, well, your family can't be too happy about that, right? And yeah, they agreed. Is culturally they want to pass on the name. And so when your child is deciding not to have children, you pretty much put an end to that. And whenever you're talking about the one child policy in China, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit here too, is suddenly that ends with you. Your whole family legacy, lineage, everything is done because you have chosen not to have children. And this isn't anything new, right? In 2016 or 2015, China relinquished a bit of the control over the one-child policy and enabled people to have up to 3 children. And by 2021, they completely got rid of it, to the point where it says, not completely got rid of it, but says, you can only have up to 3. That did nothing to population decline. And in having that conversation with that gentleman, he was telling me, by 2100, we would only see China will decrease its population from 1.4 billion to an estimated 800 million people, which is almost like it's a 50% decline. So if you look at the trajectory of the world, and I'm drawing, if you're listening to the audio podcast, I'm drawing with my hands this this chart of X and Y chart, and its trajectory is going up, and we're getting to a point where we're at the height, and that decline where it comes back down and it starts to autocorrect, and which is we're already kind of there. It's already starting to decrease. It gets insane. We're gonna get to a point where multiple nations are gonna have little to no children. And there's already schools out there that are not seeing the new students they need to survive. There are whole cities and towns in all over the world that are seeing no children in the schools. One town in particular in Hungary has now only like 45 or 44 people in the town, and most of them are over 50. And so eventually that town is going to die off. There's going to be nobody left. There's going to be little to no people. China has whole cities, towns where the apartments are all empty. There's nobody living in them. And schools just can't find new students. And so you can imagine what this means for teachers. And China obviously was a industrial power, and with the pandemic and everything, it just made it so that coupled with the one-child policy, it wasn't able to recover, and so the working class, so the people who would sustain that, there just isn't enough people, and so when I think about causation, how did we get to that place? It depends. You can go back, obviously, infinite. You can go back so far and look at it all, and why this caused this and why this caused that. Recently, I've been reading a book called No More Mr. Nice Guy, and I highly recommend it to you. The main cover, is a little bit of a hard thing to grasp, especially when if you look at it from the outset. But they say don't judge a book by its cover, and I definitely tell you not to judge a book by its cover, because the subtitle for this book is A Proven Plan for Getting What You Want in Love, Sex, and Life. And as somebody who's making his way through the book, a lot of people might look at that subtitle and be like, whoa, like that's just not right, or what, why would that be titled that? Here's the thing about this book. This book is essentially talking about people who are nice guys, give themselves to other people and don't care for themselves. And so when you do something like that, you ultimately don't know what you want And I'm saying that the nice guys don't really know what they want, and they buckle and they pursue things that other people want and other people need while self-sacrificing themselves. And so whenever it comes time to getting what they want, they don't know how to express it, nor do they know how to take or get what they need from people. Now, so if you're thinking about a person like that, imagine I get into a relationship as a needy person that I am with somebody who I think can give me those things or can provide those things for me. And I make them and I put them on a pedestal and I do everything I can to try to appease them. And, over time, you become resentful. The person takes advantage of you, whatever, and you don't end up getting what you want. And so the book is essentially telling people to take care of themselves, utmost themselves, and take care of themselves to the point where they understand what they need and what they want. Because if they don't understand themselves, then they're going to make decisions that don't ultimately take care of themselves. It's kind of the gist of the conversation of the book. And why am I talking about the book? Well, one of the premises in the book is that we become, and actually I'll go there. World War. It talks about the World War and how men had to leave. Fighting able-bodied men had to leave their homes, or leave their normal lives and go to another country to go fight. Obviously Germany, and so this vacuum. So you can imagine what this does to children in a household situation. Without a male figure in the family, suddenly these children are under women care, under the female care in the household, and that dynamic of let's just use boys, because the book is talking about men. As boys, suddenly they were chasing to appease their mothers. And why this is applicable and why this is so relevant to me is you'll hear me speak about this dishwashing incident that I have with my mother. Is I was trying my best to put the dish rack to her preference, and gain her approval for doing a job well done. And that never happened. That never occurred. I was always met with criticism, always met with disappointment. And, this caused me to become a nice guy myself. So you can imagine what this does to men over a long period of time, is that we grow up, we start dating, we get married, and by continuing to be a nice guy, you continue pursuing this appeasing of the female, of a female, and that dynamic causes us to not lead, causes us to not be the fathers that we can be. It causes us to disconnect ourselves. It causes us to make decisions that don't that aren't in the favor of leadership. So the book talks about the World War and how that vacuum caused all these males, all these men to become nice guys, is to chase after female appeasement, chase after their approval, and that dynamic is, and not to mention, once the war was over, these men came back. The men that did survive came back, carrying PTSD, carrying trauma, and also to the point where they didn't. How do you describe something that you went through to somebody who didn't know or wasn't there, right? You have this with concerts. You go to a concert, you have a blast, you went with friends, and it seems like you're connected to these friends even deeper because suddenly you understand one another. So, oh man, that concert was amazing. You go to explain it to a friend who wasn't there. It just doesn't have that oomph. It doesn't have that it just doesn't have the same. It's hard to explain that experience to people. The same happened to these men as they came back from wars, that their wives just didn't understand. You got the PTSD aspect of it. We weren't very good at speaking about our problems already as men, so there wasn't a whole lot of space over there then to speak about these issues and get the help to get over it. And so these men, these fathers, carried this trauma on, and that perpetuates over the generations. The children appeasing women or appeasing mothers, seeking only the approval of women, and without that male leadership in the family, caused this great rift. And I think about where we are as a civilization, especially when it comes to men, and how we don't share about our problems and how we have to suck it up. It's like, no wonder we're here. It's, after the war, everybody had nowhere to go with this information. You suddenly had, you went training, to boot camp or whatever to get ready to go to Germany. You met all these guys from all over the United States, let's just say, and then after the war is done, you've lost maybe like 2/3 of the guys that you started out with, and you're also living in different places. Like, where do you go to release that information and talk about it? And I'm going to tie this into the thing that we do here at Noble Father, which is our meetups. So we have that dynamic. World War happened, fathers left, giant vacuum, and then we have sons and daughters chasing after the approval of their mothers, right? Because the mother suddenly was thrust into the role of the leader in the household, and that's a very difficult thing. So we fast forward now to, one-child policy, right? China was growing really, really fast. In the 70s and 80s, there was giant famines because there wasn't enough food, with the Cultural Revolution and whatnot. And the government, in trying to stem that, which is kind of it's counterintuitive to me to think that in a time of famine that families would have abundance of children, given the situation, right? We're at this time of place right now of abundance in our society. Sure, cost of living is high. Like, so many things just doesn't make it to be a healthy environment to raise children. But yet, in their famine and in their hardship, families were having children, to the point where the government felt we need to avoid overpopulation and implement this one-child policy to stem that. Obviously, that was a survival mechanism. It was trying to not overwhelm society, and implement this. Obviously, this caused a huge rift, caused even greater problems, right? And stuff that they couldn't fully anticipate. But now we're definitely paying the price for. So when we're talking about negative population increase, only having one child, it did slow it down, and it slowed it down dramatically. But now we're seeing the height of that, is that now we've gotten to the point where nobody's having kids. We've gotten to the point where nobody's having more than one kid, and that is an issue. And even taking away the full policy doesn't enable that at all. So you can imagine, the pressure, especially for China, and I've talked about this, is if you're the only child raised by your grandparents because society demands you work and keep the family afloat. If you're a son in that situation, you have no example of how fatherhood is done. You have no example of the type of woman to look for as a man, and you have no one to push your aggression up against. And so, you have no siblings to learn how to share even. So even that has an effect on fatherhood. And so, we're eventually going to end up in a place of collapse. We're not going to have many kids. So society is ultimately going to collapse. And I forgot to tie in something there. Oh, tie into the meetups. So, one of the things that we do now, and serves a major part of what Noble Father is all about is the meetups that we do. So you might be a first-time listener and wondering, well, what kind of meetup are we talking about here? Well, when I came out of the pandemic, I felt like, even though I was very social, I didn't have a lot of spaces. I might have said this in the last episode. but I felt like there wasn't a lot of spaces to talk as men. Similar to what I said about the World War, right? You come back and you have nowhere to go with this information. Nobody will fully understand the words that are coming out of your mouth. They won't understand the experiences you went through, the emotional aspect of it, the mental aspect of it, the spiritual aspect of it. Um, once you go to war with somebody, and I'm not saying it like I know what it's like. You resonate with that person. You are suddenly eternally bonded to that person. Just think of a crazy experience that you had. Maybe your most profound moment, right? When I think about it, I think of like, a summer camp that I served with a certain crew with, and the experiences that we had together, the time that we spent together was something that deepened our bond. And I don't need to explain anything to this person because they understood what it was like to work together that summer. They understood the pressures that we faced together, the stresses that we had, and special occurrences that happen, and things that, like, events that happen that we all feel at the same time. I felt like I didn't have those spaces to learn from other fathers, and if I was feeling that with the spaces, with the circles and spaces that I had, that I wondered how many fathers out there had the same kind of problem. And that was furthered to the point where, when I'm on the Facebook groups, the giant Facebook groups with hundreds of thousands of members, of the stuff that I was seeing, I didn't see this as community. I didn't see it as being conducive to a healthy society, and even society on the internet, let's just say. I felt like there was such a need for it. And if you ask people, about fathers and men, and you ask them, do we talk about our problems enough? They'll all agree. They'll all be on the same page and say, yeah, as men and as fathers, we don't talk enough about our problems. And this causes a huge problem for us in mental health, in leadership, and how do we take care of our families, how we take care of ourselves even. And so went to create a space, and we meet over Zoom, and we just come. It was just a safe space, confidential space. As a life coach myself, I'm not there to solve people's problems. I'm not there to change them. I'm not there to manipulate them or anything. It's just a space for them to be, and to have others who understand the journey, and to support them and to grow together in a safe environment. And the community that we've built, I don't even call it a community. I'd call it like a family. Like we're all for each other and want to help each other on this journey. Last week I talked about, the movie Fury. Who do you want in your tank? Like who would be the guys that are in your tank? If you went out in society and you asked men, who would you go to war with and potentially die with in a tank? Like who would jump on a grenade for you? And a lot of men would probably don't have anybody like that. There's a reel that I saw recently, and this is one that circulated a lot amongst men, is this girl is like, oh, talk about problems. And multiple reels of men just saying, what, you talk about your problems? Or what, you have people you turn to whenever you have problems to talk about? It's like, no, nobody gives a shit, or nobody cares. That's usually the general sentiment amongst men, is that you got to suck it up, because that softness and that showing of emotion is weak. And nobody cares, and nobody gives a shit about you. That's really the sentiment that most men feel in society. And I sought to change that. I sought to create a space where men were welcome and open and speak genuinely about their feelings and the things that are happening in their lives, and get support from other fathers who understand the journey, or who have gone through what they've gone through. And so, when I think about the World War and the one-child policy and fathers and the way that we are now as a civilization, how manless, how leaderless it is. So interesting. Yesterday, or actually a few days ago, I was on the meetup. I was writing down some things, and people, drops, like some of the dads in the dads in the group, in the meetups, drop like value bombs. Like they just drop quotes that they get whenever they, when we come to a certain topic or whatever, they feel the need to share it. One of the quotes that was shared in the group by one of our members, Jason, he says, "In the absence of true leadership, people will follow anything." And that's very true. That's very indicative of the times that we live in right now. Is that, imagine a family without a father, or a father who works out, out of the house all the time. Where does the leadership go? It disappears. Who bears the brunt of that leadership? Who shows the man of the house, or who shows the men, the little boys of the house, how to be men in a household? And shows the, like, the introduction says, who shows a man, the son, how to be the man that he's supposed to be in the future, and shows the daughter what man to look for in the future. In the absence of a man, what is a daughter going to go look for, right? Attention of men. Because she didn't get it, well, she's going to go seek it from other men. And generally, it's not good, the type of attention they get, right? What does a daughter want from her father? Is when a daughter goes to put on a dress, for the father to look and appreciate her and say how beautiful she is and how wonderful she looks, right? Do you want other men to tell your daughter that, and you not having that opportunity? And let me tell you, that usually gets to the point of sexualizing your daughters. Nobody, if your daughter goes out to seek that from somebody else, it's gonna look very wrong. It's gonna look very disgusting. Not to mention, she's gonna be used to the fact that her father's not there, and so when she looks at her mother, who's there, she's used to the male figure not being there. And what kind of standard does this set for your daughter? Now, for your son, even, your son's not there. You seek the approval of your mother. That's going to fray a relationship between your son and other men. We already see this, in understanding shooters and active shooters in public, is that a lot of those boys don't have somebody to feed back that aggression up against. And so this abundance of testosterone and of aggression goes nowhere, and they don't know where to channel it. They'll end up taking it out on the world. Now, obviously, not every single situation is going to be like this, and not every boy or girl is going to end up like this, but life is a game of mitigation. Life is a game of understanding that even if we did everything right, things can still go wrong. But yet that doesn't mean that we don't try our best to eliminate that. We need to set the foundation of fatherhood. We need to set the foundation of manhood for both our sons and for our daughters. And that's really where the meetup came in, was just to grow. Is there a space where men can grow instead of going on these Facebook groups where you don't really know everybody else? And so, anybody can just be a keyboard warrior and just type whatever they want and joke however they want and share pictures of their wives or whatever it is they do. We sought to create a space to grow genuinely, and to have people who actually give a shit about you, and I say this, like, these guys I would jump in a tank with and go to war with, and I'd be okay dying with them. Like, against insurmountable odds, I would easily do that for these men. Anyway, there's not a lot of spaces, and not a lot of people can say that, and that's a privilege. I'm proud and glad that I have these men in my corner. But that's really the gist of it, right? Like, we're entering these really dark times ahead with this population decline stuff that's coming out now. We're going to be hearing more and more about it, right? The aging population is going to die, and there's not going to be enough children. There's not going to be enough young generations that will carry the mantle of fatherhood forward. Interestingly, yesterday, whenever we were getting ready for church, my son woke up with a little bit of oomph in his step. Like, he was fired up, and he was like, "Dad, it was so weird. It was so strange." And even as he was talking about it, you can tell he was excited about it. He said that God spoke to me yesterday. Like, God spoke to me in the morning. He said, I was having a dream, and suddenly I just woke up, and he said that God told him that he was going to be a good leader. And I sat there, let it sink in for a bit. You can see this kid was excited that he got such a word from God, and And then I sought to ask him. I was like, hey, so what do you think God meant? What kind of leader do you think God is meaning there? And he said that he was going to be a good leader in his family. And I was like, yeah, you think one day you're going to be a leader of the Noble Father group? And he's like, and his eyes kind of just widened. He was like, and his response was just, yeah, I think I would be. And when I look at him, and this is something that I talk with the other fathers in the group about, is like, hey man, like one day your son is going to be with my son, and we're going to be friends, and they're going to be friends, and they're going to be leading the groups. They're going to be noble sons who are now noble fathers themselves, and they're going to be walking in step and trying to continue this legacy, this torch, and dreaming, and potentially, hopefully, by then we'd have a retreat site and be able to fulfill what we said we're going to do together. And it was just so beautiful to me to see that and to hear that from my son. He's only 8. And so for God to give him that word, and he knew immediately that was not from him. He was excited. He shared it with his friends at church, and he was sharing it with people. And this is what we're missing. So you can imagine if we don't have kids anymore, we'd have a decline in fathers even. What is the world going to look like eventually? It's not good. So, I have no answers to this, right? And each person, needs, okay, so actually, let's talk about that. What is the result of something like this? Well, if we had more fathers, let's just start with that. If we had more fathers, more intentional, purposeful, present fathers, what could that do? What could that mean? Well, for one, my son, let's just use my son. And I don't mean to say this in a way that's like bragging about my own journey as a father. I'm not a perfect father, and I'm doing the best that I can. But he sees his father leading his family, creating his life, dreaming, chasing the goals, working on himself, personally developing himself, being in optimal learning environments with other people who help him to grow. He sees the joy of fatherhood. He gets to experience that joy of fatherhood with his dad, and it makes him want to be a dad. I've already heard my son say that. He says he wants to be a dad. He wants to be a father. And so there's this drive. It's a desire within him. I wouldn't be creating Noble Father now if I didn't have that desire within myself either. As soon as I married my wife, I told her I want to have kids. It was immediate. Is there repercussions from that? Of course, I probably should have spent more time getting to know her or whatnot. And, we bypassed a lot of those things and jumped straight into having kids. That desire instilled in me a desire to want to have kids. Now, if you're having children with societal pressure, and you see the pressure and how difficult it is to even stay afloat for yourself, why would you have kids, right? You had no role model of a father growing up. Why would you want to have kids, right? You had a bad experience, and you carry this generational trauma from your father. Or if your father was even there, why would you want to have kids? And so, okay, so we want to be fathers. What does good fatherhood look like? That would be a byproduct of that. We would see more children wanting to be fathers themselves, and they would want to have more children, or say, at least 2 to at least stabilize it. For ourselves, we had our son, and we just felt that being lonely is not good. And my wife obviously grew up as an only child, and I have 3 siblings myself, so I understand having siblings and the dynamics of it. We sought to, originally, we wanted to have, a friend, somebody with him to be able to do life together. And we wanted a son, because in 2 boys, they could learn and play and fight and grow up together and whatever. And then we found out we had a daughter, and we're like, wow, we're still very, very energized and pumped for it. Now we have 1 of each, which, mathematically speaking, as an Asian, it just made sense. I'm just, very, very happy about that. And now they're doing life together. And there's just beauty. getting to see them grow up together and do life together. And, what does that look like one day, right? We don't know. But this is where we're at now as a civilization. And I hope that, this conversation that I'm having today, spurs you on to do life better, to see the value that you bring in an environment. You impact fathers more than you know. You might not be one. You might not be a male. You're listening to this podcast, but you have a great impact on that, as a whole. And so I want to invite you into this work, is that if you are a father listening to this and you want to join the meetups, hey, that is available. You can check out the link tree in the bios, and you'll be able to find our meetups. We meet on Thursdays at 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. Eastern time, and we do it over Zoom, and it's just a wonderful space to be. If you want to just come check it out and you don't want to say anything, just turn off your camera, shoot me a private message in the chat, and I will just let you hang out. You can see and listen to how we do things. This is a space primarily for fathers and for men, and so if you're a woman listening to this, that space isn't available to you, and that's to preserve the confidentiality and the safeness of the space. Also, if you're listening to this podcast now, and you haven't given me a review or given the podcast a review, please do that. If you're on the Apple platform, you can go to the Apple iTunes and find the podcast and actually leave a rating. It really helps me to get this before a greater audience, and I definitely need that support. If you're not able to do any of that or not willing to do that, please feel free to share this with your friends and family, just to get this before a greater audience. I genuinely care about this work. I am genuinely passionate about fathers and helping fathers and helping children. I want to make sure that the environment that my kids grow up in is a good one and an optimal one. And so in serving other fathers, I am hoping that their children grow up to create a better world for my children when they grow up as well. And that's really all I wanted to share on today's episode. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to try to keep these to a certain length in the future here. There's just a lot. Every single week I have tons to share. And so remember, Mondays are my normal podcast releases, public podcast release, and I'm going to be starting to do Wednesday podcast releases for the Patreon members. And so if you're able to support this work, just think about it as you're treating me to a coffee or a dinner every single month to keep this afloat. And this is all I do for work, and I need that support to continue growing. And I don't do this to, line my own pocket. I need this to sustain myself, and I also need this to support other fathers out there. I invest in myself constantly with the things that you're seeing in this podcast, and I'm always investing in my own growth, and that's not cheap and that's not easy. And so if you're able to support, please consider giving to the Patreon. It's a membership platform. You'd be able to subscribe to different tiers and get different perks, like getting access to the Wednesday Patreon podcast releases that I'm going to be doing. This is just value that I provide to the community, to other people out there, and for me to get the value that I get and the knowledge that I get from God to fathers and people everywhere. And so I want to say thank you. Thank you for joining me again for another episode, and I hope to see you next week. Bye for now.